Mr. Chen had been driving for hours through the winding mountain roads when his car started making strange noises. The engine was overheating, and he knew he needed to find help soon. As a successful businessman who owned several factories in the city, he wasn't used to being stuck in remote places like this. But sometimes life throws unexpected challenges your way. He pulled into a small village that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The houses were old and weathered, with cracked walls and roofs that had seen better days. Chickens wandered freely in the dusty streets, and elderly people sat in the shade, watching his expensive car with curious eyes. This was clearly a place where money was hard to come by. While looking for a mechanic, Mr. Chen heard shouting coming from the village center. His curiosity got the better of him, and he walked toward the commotion. What he saw there would change his life forever. In the middle of the village square, a crowd had gathered around a man who looked desperate and broken. The man's clothes were torn and dirty. His face was sunken with worry, and his hands shook as he spoke to the people around him. But what caught Mr. Chen's attention were the three young women standing behind this man. They were clearly his daughters, and they were holding on to each other tightly, their eyes filled with fear. The oldest girl looked to be around 20. She had her arms wrapped protectively around her two younger sisters, trying to shield them from the staring crowd. Her face showed a maturity beyond her years, the kind that comes from taking care of others when you're still young yourself. The middle sister appeared to be about 18, and she kept looking between her father and the crowd with confusion and terror. The youngest, probably 16, was crying quietly, her small frame trembling against her older sister. Mr. Chen moved closer to understand what was happening. The desperate father was speaking loudly to anyone who would listen. His voice cracked with emotion as he explained his situation. The rains hadn't come for 3 seasons. His crops had failed completely. The small savings he had were gone. The loan sharks from the city had given him one final deadline: pay everything back in 3 days or lose everything he owned. But the worst part was what the father was proposing to solve his problem. He was offering his daughters to anyone willing to pay his debts. The crowd of men around him weren't there to help. They were there to make deals. Some were old enough to be the girls' grandfathers. Others had rough faces and cruel eyes that made Mr. Chen's stomach turn. One particularly unpleasant man stepped forward, examining the sisters like they were animals at a market. He walked around them slowly, making comments about their appearance while the girls shrank back in horror. The oldest sister tried to speak up to protest, but her father quickly silenced her with a desperate look that said he had no other choice. Mr. Chen felt his heart breaking as he watched this scene unfold. These weren't objects to be sold. They were young women with hopes, dreams, and their whole lives ahead of them. The youngest was barely more than a child. How could their own father even consider such a thing? But as he looked closer at the father, Mr. Chen began to understand the man's impossible situation. This wasn't a cruel father selling his daughters for profit. This was a broken man who had run out of options. His face showed the agony of what he was doing. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he spoke to potential buyers. This was killing him inside, but he genuinely believed he had no other choice. The father explained through his tears that the loan sharks had already threatened to burn down his house if he didn't pay. They had beaten him twice and promised worse if he didn't deliver the money. He had already sold everything else he owned: his animals, his tools, even his wife's jewelry. The only things left were his daughters, and if he didn't find a solution, the whole family would end up on the streets or worse. Mr. Chen learned that the father owed the equivalent of $15,000, a fortune in this poor village, but not an impossible amount for someone like him. The tragic irony wasn't lost on him. The amount that could destroy this family was less than what he spent on a family vacation. As the negotiations continued, Mr. Chen watched the sisters' reactions. With growing concern, the oldest kept whispering reassurances to her younger sisters, trying to be strong for them even though she was clearly terrified. The middle sister had gone completely silent, staring at the ground as if she could disappear if she didn't look at what was happening. The youngest couldn't stop crying, and her quiet sobs cut through Mr. Chen's heart like a knife. The crowd of potential buyers grew more aggressive as the day wore on. They started making crude comments about what they planned to do with the girls. Some argued over who had the right to choose first. Others discussed the girls' potential value in different kinds of work that Mr. Chen didn't want to think about. The father looked sick as he listened to these conversations, but he didn't have the luxury of walking away. Then something happened that made Mr. Chen's blood boil. One of the men grabbed the youngest sister's arm to get a better look at her. She cried out in fear, and her sisters immediately moved to protect her. But the man pushed them aside roughly, treating them like they were already his property. The oldest sister fell to the ground hard, and Mr. Chen saw something snap in her eyes, a light going out that might never come back. That was the moment Mr. Chen knew he couldn't just stand there and watch anymore. He had been raised to believe that with great fortune comes great responsibility. His own father had taught him that successful people have a duty to help those who can't help themselves. He had 3 grown sons at home who had good hearts and successful careers. His house was large and empty since his wife had passed away 5 years earlier. He had the means to solve this problem, and more importantly, he had the moral obligation to act. But Mr. Chen also knew he had to be smart about how he handled this situation. If he just charged in without thinking, he might make things worse for everyone involved. The crowd looked rough, and some of them might not take kindly to an outsider interfering with their business. He needed to approach this carefully, in a way that would save the girls without creating new problems. As he stood there planning his next move, Mr. Chen thought about his own sons waiting at home. What would they think of their father if he walked away from this situation? How could he look them in the eye knowing he had the power to save 3 innocent lives but chose not to use it? The answer was simple. He couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. The sun was starting to set, and the father was getting more desperate as the day wore on. Some of the buyers were getting impatient and making threats of their own. The situation was reaching a breaking point, and Mr. Chen knew he had to act now, or these 3 sisters would disappear forever into a nightmare they might never escape from. He took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and stepped forward into the crowd. Mr. Chen walked straight into the middle of the crowd, his heart pounding but his mind clear about what he needed to do. The rough men who had been haggling over the 3 sisters turned to look at this well-dressed stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. His clean clothes and confident posture made it obvious he wasn't from their village. "Excuse me," Mr. Chen said in a calm but firm voice, addressing the desperate father directly. "I couldn't help but overhear your situation. Perhaps we can discuss this privately?" The father looked confused. He had been dealing with these local men all day, and suddenly the stranger was offering to talk. Some of the buyers started grumbling, annoyed that someone was interrupting their negotiations. One particularly aggressive man stepped forward and told Mr. Chen to mind his own business and move along. But Mr. Chen didn't back down. He had dealt with difficult people in business for years, and he knew how to handle himself. He calmly reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, making sure everyone could see the thick stack of cash inside. The grumbling stopped immediately. Money talks in any language, and everyone in that crowd understood what they were looking at. "Sir," Mr. Chen said to the father, "you mentioned you owe $15,000. What if I told you there might be another solution to your problem?" The father's eyes widened with desperate hope, but also suspicion. In his experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. He had been tricked and cheated so many times that trusting anyone had become nearly impossible. But looking at his 3 daughters huddled together behind him, he knew he had to at least listen. The other buyers weren't happy about this development. They had been looking forward to their purchases, and now some outsider was trying to ruin their deals. A few of them started making threatening comments about what happens to people who interfere with local business. The situation was getting tense, and Mr. Chen realized he needed to handle this carefully. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the crowd while keeping his voice steady, "I understand you've invested time here today, but I'm prepared to make this worth everyone's while." He pulled out several bills and handed them to the most aggressive buyers. "For your trouble and your time." It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was more than most of these men saw in a month. They took the cash and started backing away, muttering among themselves, but no longer interested in causing problems. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. With the crowd dispersing, Mr. Chen was finally able to speak privately with the father and his daughters. The three sisters were still clinging to each other, not sure whether this new development was good or bad. They had learned not to trust strangers, especially men who appeared out of nowhere making promises. The father introduced himself as Old Wang and explained his situation in more detail. 3 years of drought had destroyed his small farm completely. He had borrowed money to buy seeds and fertilizer, hoping each season would be better than the last. Instead, each year had been worse. The interest on his loans had grown until the debt became impossible to manage. Mr. Chen listened carefully as Old Wang talked about the loan sharks who had been terrorizing his family. They weren't just threatening to take his land. They had made it clear that if he didn't pay, they would sell his daughters themselves to recover the money. At least this way, Old Wang thought, he could choose who they went to and maybe ensure they were treated decently. The oldest daughter, who had been quiet during this conversation, finally spoke up. Her name was May, and despite her fear, she had a strong voice and intelligent eyes. She told Mr. Chen that she had been taking care of her younger sister since their mother died 2 years earlier. She had tried to find work in the village, but there were no opportunities for young women. Everything she earned from small jobs barely bought enough food to keep them alive. The middle sister, Lin, was clearly the scholar of the family. Even in this terrible situation, she spoke thoughtfully and asked Mr. Chen direct questions about his intentions. She wanted to know exactly what he was proposing and what would be expected of them in return. Her intelligence was obvious, even though she had never had the chance to get a proper education. The youngest, Xiao, stayed close to her sisters and didn't say much, but Mr. Chen could see she was listening to everything carefully. Despite her youth, she had an artistic eye. Even in her simple, worn clothes, she had arranged a small flower in her hair and drawn little patterns in the dust with her finger. While they talked, Mr. Chen explained his own situation honestly. He was a widower with 3 grown sons who lived in a large house in the city. His business was successful, and he had more than enough money to pay Old Wang's debts. But more importantly, his home had felt empty and sad since his wife passed away. His sons were good men, but they spent most of their time working. The house needed life and warmth again. He made it clear that he wasn't buying the sisters like the other men had planned to do. Instead, he was offering them a chance at a different life. They would live in his house as family members, not servants. They would go to school and learn skills that could give them independence and choices. In time, if they chose to, they could marry his sons. But only if genuine love developed between them. There would be no pressure and no forced arrangements. Old Wang couldn't believe what he was hearing. This stranger was offering to solve all his problems and give his daughters opportunities they could never have in the village. But he was also a father who loved his children, and the thought of sending them away with someone he had just met was terrifying. The sisters whispered among themselves in their local dialect, discussing this unexpected turn of events. May, as the oldest, finally spoke for all of them. She said they understood the risks of going with a stranger, but they also understood the certainty of what would happen if they stayed. They had watched other girls from their village disappear into situations that no one talked about afterward. Mr. Chen gave them time to think and discuss while he walked Old Wang through exactly how the debt payment would work. He would wire the money directly to the loan sharks that very evening, ensuring Old Wang's safety. He would also leave additional money for Old Wang to restart his farming operation when the rains returned. But he made one condition clear. This was a permanent arrangement. The sisters would become part of his family, and there would be no going back to the old life of poverty and desperation. They would need to adapt to city life, learn new customs, and work hard to build better futures for themselves. As the sun began to set over the village, the sisters made their decision. Holding hands tightly, they told Mr. Chen they were ready to trust him with their lives. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Old Wang cried as he hugged each of his daughters goodbye, knowing this was probably the last time he would see them, but believing it was their only chance for happiness. Mr. Chen made the phone calls to arrange the debt payment, while the sisters gathered their few belongings. Everything they owned fit into a single small bag. As they walked toward his car, May looked back at the village square where their nightmare had almost begun, then forward toward the road that would take them to their new life. The 3-hour car ride to the city was the longest journey the sisters had ever taken. They sat quietly in the back seat of Mr. Chen's comfortable car, watching the landscape change from their familiar rural village to bustling towns, and finally to the bright lights of the big city. Everything was so different from what they knew: tall buildings instead of small houses, busy streets instead of quiet dirt roads, and more people in one block than lived in their entire village. Mr. Chen tried to make conversation during the drive, but he could tell the sisters were overwhelmed. He stopped at a roadside restaurant halfway through the journey and bought them their first real meal in days. Watching them eat slowly and carefully, as if they couldn't believe the food was really theirs, reminded him of just how desperate their situation had been. When they finally arrived at his house, the sisters couldn't hide their amazement. The building was 3 stories tall with a beautiful garden in front and modern cars parked in the driveway. To them, it looked like a palace. They had never seen anything so grand, and suddenly they felt very small and out of place. Mr. Chen's 3 sons were waiting in the living room when they arrived. He had called ahead to explain the situation, but seeing 3 young women walk through their front door was still a shock for everyone involved. The eldest son, Wei, was 25 and worked as a doctor at the city hospital. He had his father's kind eyes and gentle manner. The middle son, Jun, was 23 and worked as an engineer for a construction company. He was more serious and quiet than his brother. The youngest son, Ming, was 21 and still finishing his studies at the university. He had an artistic personality and seemed the most curious about the new arrivals. The introductions were awkward at first. Nobody was quite sure how to act or what to say. The sisters stayed close together, still wearing their simple village clothes and feeling completely out of place in this wealthy home. The sons were polite but uncertain about how to treat these young women who had suddenly become part of their household. Mrs. Liu, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for the family for years, took charge of the situation. She immediately understood that the sisters needed practical help more than formal introductions. She led them upstairs to show them their rooms. Each sister would have her own bedroom with a private bathroom, something they had never experienced before. The first few days were filled with small discoveries and adjustments. The sisters had never used electric appliances, taken hot showers, or slept in beds with soft mattresses. Everything was new and sometimes frightening. Xiao, the youngest, was afraid to touch anything expensive, worried she might break something and get in trouble. Mr. Chen noticed their discomfort and made an effort to help them feel at home. He sat with them at meals and told them stories about his own childhood, when his family had been poor and struggled to make ends meet. He explained that money didn't make people better or worse. It just gave them different opportunities and responsibilities. The breakthrough came when May, the oldest sister, fell sick with a fever during their first week. She had been trying so hard to be strong for her younger sisters that she had exhausted herself completely. When Wei, the doctor's son, gently examined her and prescribed medicine, she broke down crying for the first time since they had arrived. All the fear and stress she had been holding inside came pouring out. Wei sat with her while she cried, not saying much, but just being present. He brought her soup and made sure she took her medicine on time. His kindness wasn't romantic. It was the kind of care one human being shows another when they're suffering. But it marked the beginning of real trust between the sisters and their new family. Jun, the engineer, discovered that Lin had an incredible mind for mathematics when he found her solving complex problems in an old textbook she had found in the house library. She had taught herself basic math from a damaged schoolbook back in the village, but she had never had a chance to learn advanced concepts. Jun started spending evenings teaching her engineering principles, amazed by how quickly she understood complicated ideas. Ming connected with Xiao through art. He found her one afternoon drawing detailed pictures of flowers with a piece of charcoal on scraps of paper. Her natural talent was obvious, even with such simple materials. He brought her proper art supplies and showed her techniques he had learned in his university classes. For the first time since arriving, Xiao smiled genuinely as she experimented with colored pencils and watercolor paints. Mr. Chen watched these relationships developing with satisfaction, but also with careful attention. He made it clear to his sons that the sisters were to be treated with complete respect and that any romantic feelings would need to develop naturally over time. He also spoke regularly with the sisters to make sure they felt safe and comfortable in their new home. The household routines gradually adjusted to accommodate everyone's needs. The sisters learned to use the modern kitchen and began helping Mrs. Liu prepare meals, sharing recipes from their village that added new flavors to the family's dinner table. They learned to operate the washing machine, use the computer, and navigate the city's public transportation system. Education became a priority. Mr. Chen enrolled all three sisters in appropriate schools. Mei in adult education classes to finish her high school diploma, Lin in evening courses to catch up on advanced mathematics and science, and Zhao in both regular high school and weekend art classes. The sisters threw themselves into their studies with determination, understanding that education was their key to independence and a better future. There were challenging moments too. Sometimes the sisters would have nightmares about their old life or wake up crying from memories of their desperate father and the terrifying marketplace. The cultural differences between village and city life sometimes caused misunderstandings. Simple things like using elevators, ordering food at restaurants, or understanding city customs required patience and practice. The sons also had to adjust their expectations and behaviors. They were used to a quiet household focused on work and study. Suddenly there were feminine voices, laughter, and different perspectives on everything from politics to what to watch on television. It was an adjustment, but a welcome one that brought new energy to their home. After 2 months, the transformation was remarkable. The sisters had gained weight and looked healthier. Their confidence was growing daily as they mastered new skills and knowledge. Mei discovered she had a talent for languages and business, often helping Mr. Chen with correspondence from his international clients. Lin was excelling in her technical studies and dreaming of becoming an engineer herself. Xiao was creating beautiful artwork that Ming proudly displayed around the house. Most importantly, the fear in their eyes was gradually being replaced by hope. They were beginning to believe that their nightmare was truly over, and that they could build the kind of future they had never dared to imagine. The house that had once felt empty and sad was now filled with conversation, laughter, and the warmth of a real family learning to care for each other. 2 years had passed since that life-changing day in the village marketplace, and the Chen household had transformed into something beautiful and unexpected. What started as an act of compassion had grown into genuine family bonds that surprised everyone involved. The change was most obvious during the family's evening routines. Instead of 3 sons eating dinner in relative silence while focusing on their work, the dining room now buzzed with animated conversations about everything from current events to funny stories from their day. The sisters had brought a warmth and liveliness to the house that had been missing since Mrs. Chen passed away years earlier. Mei had blossomed into a confident young woman who could hold her own in any conversation. Her natural intelligence, combined with 2 years of intensive education, had made her incredibly well-read and articulate. She had started helping Mr. Chen with his business, translating documents and managing correspondence with international clients. But it was her evening discussions with Wei that really showed her growth. Wei would come home from long shifts at the hospital, exhausted from dealing with difficult cases and hospital politics. He found that talking with Mei about his day helped him process the stress and maintain his compassion for his patients. She had a way of listening that made him feel understood, and her insights often helped him see situations from new perspectives. What started as casual conversations gradually became the highlight of Wei's day. He found himself looking forward to coming home, knowing Mei would be there with her warm smile and thoughtful questions about his work. She never made him feel guilty about the long hours his career demanded, but instead showed genuine interest in the lives he was helping to save. One evening, Wei realized he had been talking about a particularly difficult surgery for over an hour, and Mei had listened intently to every word. When he apologized for monopolizing the conversation, She smiled and told him that his dedication to helping people was one of the things she admired most about him. That was the moment Wei understood his feelings had grown far beyond friendship. Meanwhile, Jun and Lin had developed their own special connection through their shared love of problem-solving. What had started as tutoring sessions had evolved into collaborative projects where they worked as equals. Lin's quick mind and fresh perspective often helped Jun see engineering challenges in new ways. They spent countless evenings hunched over blueprints and calculations, working through complex problems together. Jun was amazed by how Lin could grasp advanced concepts that took most people years to understand. Her questions weren't just about learning. They often revealed flaws in existing designs or suggested innovative improvements. The breakthrough in their relationship came during a particularly challenging project at Jun's company. He had been struggling with a structural design that wasn't working, and after days of frustration, he brought the problem home. Lin studied the blueprints carefully and suggested a completely different approach that Jun's team hadn't considered. Her solution was so elegant and effective that Jun's supervisor asked where the idea had come from. When Jun explained that his friend Lin had suggested it, his boss was impressed enough to offer her an internship at the company. Watching Lin's face light up with joy and pride in that moment, Jun realized that somewhere along the way, his respect and admiration for her intelligence had grown into something much deeper. The youngest pair, Ming and Xiao, had perhaps the most natural progression toward romance. Their shared artistic interests had created countless opportunities for them to spend time together, working on creative projects and exploring different forms of expression. Ming had introduced Xiao to photography, and she had taken to it with the same natural talent she showed in drawing and painting. They would spend weekends exploring the city together, with Ming teaching her about composition and lighting, while Xiao showed him how to see ordinary scenes with an artist's eye. Their relationship was built on a foundation of creativity and mutual inspiration. Xiao's work had evolved dramatically under Ming's guidance, but she had also influenced his art in profound ways. Her fresh perspective and emotional honesty had helped him move beyond technical skill toward genuine artistic expression. The moment Ming knew his feelings had changed came during an art exhibition at his university. Xiao had submitted several pieces, and when one of her paintings won first prize in the amateur category, Ming felt prouder than if he had won the award himself. Watching her accept the recognition with such grace and humility, he realized he didn't just care about her as a friend and fellow artist. He was completely in love with her. Mr. Chen had been observing these developing relationships with great interest and careful attention. As a father, he wanted his sons to find happiness with partners who would love and support them. As a guardian to the three sisters, he needed to make sure their feelings were genuine and that they weren't feeling pressured into romantic relationships out of gratitude or obligation. He had several private conversations with each of his sons, asking them to examine their feelings carefully and make sure they understood the difference between attraction, gratitude, and genuine love. He reminded them that the sisters had been through trauma and might need more time to trust their own emotions. The conversations with the sisters were even more delicate. Mr. Chen wanted to make sure they felt free to make their own choices about their futures, including the choice to leave if they wanted to pursue different paths. He explained that they would always have his support and protection, regardless of whether they chose to marry his sons or not. What he discovered in these conversations surprised him. Each sister had been wondering when someone would bring up the topic of marriage, not because they felt obligated, but because they had genuinely fallen in love. They had each found in their respective partners everything they had never dared to hope for: respect, understanding, shared interests, and deep emotional connection. Mei told Mr. Chen that Wei's compassion and dedication to helping others reminded her daily that there were good men in the world. She felt safe with him in a way she had never experienced before, and his gentle strength made her feel protected without feeling controlled. Lin explained that Jun's respect for her intelligence and his excitement about her ideas made her feel valued for who she truly was, not just for her appearance or domestic skills. With him, she could dream of having a career and making her own mark on the world. Xiao shared that Ming's encouragement of her artistic talents had given her confidence she never knew she possessed. He saw beauty in her work and helped her see it in herself. With him, she felt free to express herself without fear of judgment. As spring arrived in the third year of their life together, the house was filled with an atmosphere of anticipation and joy. The relationships that had grown so naturally were ready to take the next step, and everyone involved was eager to make their commitment official. The family that had been brought together by desperate circumstances was about to be united by the strongest force of all, genuine, freely chosen love. The wedding preparations took 6 months, and they brought out the best in everyone involved. Mr. Chen insisted that this should be the celebration the sisters had never dreamed they could have, not just a simple ceremony, but a genuine expression of joy and new beginnings. The most emotional moment of the entire preparation period came when Mr. Chen suggested inviting old Wang, the sister's father, to the wedding. The idea made everyone nervous at first. The sisters hadn't seen their father since that terrible day in the village marketplace 3 years earlier, and they weren't sure how they would feel seeing him again. Mr. Chen had been quietly sending money to old Wang over the years, helping him rebuild his farm and his life. The drought had finally ended, and with proper resources, old Wang had managed to create a small but successful farming operation. More importantly, he had used the experience to help other desperate families in his village, preventing them from facing the same impossible choices he had once confronted. When old Wang received the invitation to his daughter's weddings, he broke down crying. For 3 years, he had carried the guilt and shame of what he had almost done to his children. He had written them letters many times but never sent them, convinced they must hate him for the position he had put them in. Reunion took place 2 weeks before the wedding, in the comfortable living room of the Chen house. Old Wang looked completely different from the desperate, broken man who had stood in that village square. He was clean, healthy, and dressed in simple but respectable clothes. But most importantly, his eyes showed peace instead of desperation. The sisters' reactions were mixed but ultimately healing for everyone involved. Mei, always the protector, was initially cold toward her father. She remembered too clearly how terrified her younger sisters had been that day. But when old Wang fell to his knees and begged for their forgiveness, explaining how the experience had changed him and how he had spent every day since then trying to honor their sacrifice, her anger began to soften. Lin, with her logical mind, asked the hard questions about why he had made the choices he did and what he had learned from them. Old Wang answered honestly, acknowledging his failures as a father while explaining the impossible situation that had driven him to such desperate measures. Xiao surprised everyone by being the first to forgive completely. She approached her father and hugged him, telling him that she understood he had been trying to save all of them in the only way he knew how. Her forgiveness opened the door for her sisters to begin healing their relationship with their father as well. Mr. Chen watched this reunion with deep satisfaction. He had learned from his own life that families are complicated, and forgiveness is often the key to true happiness. Seeing the sisters reconnect with their father, not as the desperate man who had almost sold them, but as a person who had learned from his mistakes and grown into someone better, completed the healing process that had started 3 years earlier. The wedding day itself was absolutely magical. Mr. Chen had arranged for the ceremony to take place in a beautiful garden venue that could accommodate both traditional village customs and modern city traditions. The sisters wore stunning white dresses that had been custom-made for them, but they also incorporated elements from their village heritage into their appearance. The most meaningful moment came when Mr. Chen formally adopted the 3 sisters as his daughters before the marriage ceremony began. He had consulted with lawyers months earlier to make sure this was done properly, ensuring that the sisters would have legal protection and inheritance rights as full members of his family. Standing before the gathered guests, Mr. Chen spoke about how 3 young women had transformed his house from an empty building into a true home. He talked about watching them grow from frightened refugees into confident, accomplished women who had enriched his family's life beyond measure. The sisters each spoke as well, thanking Mr. Chen not just for saving them from a terrible fate, but for giving them the education, support, and love they needed to become the people they were meant to be. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience as Mei, Lin, and Xiao expressed their gratitude to the man who had become their father in every way that mattered. Old Wang played a special role in the ceremony, walking each of his daughters down the aisle with tears of pride streaming down his face. This time, his tears were from joy, not desperation. He was giving his daughters to men who loved and respected them, in a ceremony that celebrated their choices rather than his desperate circumstances. The three couples exchanged vows that they had written themselves, speaking about the journey they had taken from strangers to friends to partners in life. Wei and Mei talked about their shared commitment to helping others and building a life based on compassion and understanding. Jun and Lin spoke about their excitement for the future they would build together, combining their talents and dreams. Ming and Xiao promised to inspire each other's creativity and support each other's artistic ambitions. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the village guests had ever experienced. Mr. Chen had arranged for traditional music and dancing, alongside modern entertainment. The sisters' former neighbors were amazed to see how much the three young women had grown and changed, but also how they had maintained the kindness and humility that had always defined them. The years that followed brought nothing but happiness and success to the expanded Chen family. Wei and Mei opened a medical clinic that provided affordable healthcare to rural communities, combining his medical expertise with her business skills and language abilities. Jun and Lin started their own engineering firm, specializing in sustainable building projects that helped communities develop without damaging their environment. Ming and Xiao established an art school that provided free classes to children from low-income families, ensuring that talent wouldn't be wasted due to lack of opportunity. Mr. Chen became a grandfather to 6 beautiful children over the next 5 years, and his house once again filled with the sounds of young voices and laughter. He often reflected on how that chance encounter in a remote village had led to the richest and most fulfilling period of his life. The sisters never forgot their humble origins, and they used their success to help other families facing desperate situations. They established a foundation that provided emergency assistance to families in crisis, ensuring that no parent would ever again face the impossible choice that Old Wang had confronted. Old Wang lived to see his grandchildren and to witness his daughters become pillars of their community. Before he passed away peacefully at the age of 75, he told Mr. Chen that sending his daughters away with him had been the best decision he had ever made, not because it solved his problems, but because it gave his children the chance to become everything they were meant to be. The story that began with desperation and near tragedy had become a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of second chances, and the truth that love, not obligation, creates the strongest families.